The scene opens with a haunting and cinematic view of the New York City skyline in the late 1930s, where the Statue of Liberty stands tall against a backdrop of peaceful commerce and towering skyscrapers that represent the pinnacle of modern civilization and the absolute strength of the American dream. But thousands of miles across the dark and cold Atlantic Ocean, in the flickering shadows of the Reich Chancellery, a man named Adolf Hitler stares at a detailed scale model of Manhattan with an obsession that borders on pure madness and a deep-seated hatred for the democratic world. He does not see a city of millions or a hub of international culture, but rather a fragile forest of glass and steel waiting to be ignited by a single spark of Teutonic fire falling from the heavens.
Most people believe the war was fought only on the muddy fields of Europe or the tropical islands of the Pacific, but few realize that since 1937, the Nazi leadership had been dreaming of a day when German wings would cast a terrifying shadow over the streets of Broadway. Hitler is frequently quoted by his inner circle as saying that he wanted to see the skyscrapers of the New York Jews turn into giant burning torches, and that the American people must be made to feel the crushing weight of the German will in their own homes. This was not just a strategic military goal to disrupt supply lines, but a deeply personal and ideological vendetta against a nation he viewed as a degenerate and mixed-race obstacle to his 1,000-year empire.
The camera zooms into the blueprints spread across a heavy oak table in a room filled with the echo of jackboots, where the words America Bomber are stamped in bold red ink, marking the birth of a project that many German generals secretly dismissed as a childish fantasy, but which the Führer demanded at any cost, regardless of the resources wasted. Early sketches show monstrous and grotesque aircraft with 6 or even 8 engines that look like something out of a futuristic science fiction novel, rather than a practical machine of war meant for the 1940 era. The air in these high-level meetings is thick with the smell of expensive cigars and the sound of nervous military officials whispering about the impossible physics of flying 6,000 kilometers across the open sea and back without a single stop for refueling.
They knew that the weight of the fuel alone would make the planes too heavy to take off from any existing runway in Europe, yet the fear of the Führer was far greater than the fear of the laws of gravity or the warnings of the engineers, so the order is given to begin a desperate race against time that would eventually lead to the most bizarre and terrifying engineering designs in human history, involving suborbital gliders and giant flying wings. As the music swells with a dark and industrial undertone, we see the transition from the golden lights of a peaceful New York evening to the cold and gray hangars of Augsburg and Dessau, where the first metal skeletons of these giant bombers are being assembled in total secret by men who knew that if they failed, the price would be their lives, or a one-way ticket to the Eastern Front.
Hitler's eyes remain fixed on the model of the Empire State Building, as if he could already hear the screams of the city from across the ocean, and he imagines the psychological collapse of the United States when the first bombs fall on Manhattan. This obsession with a single spectacular strike was a hallmark of the Nazi leadership, who often chose grand and theatrical gestures over sound military strategy, believing that a weapon of enough scale could win the war in a single afternoon. The scene captures the eerie silence of the planning rooms, where the fate of millions was discussed as if it were a simple game of chess played on a global map with no regard for the human cost.
As the camera slowly pulls back, we see the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean standing as a natural barrier that the German Luftwaffe is determined to conquer through sheer engineering brutality. The light in the Chancellery dims until only the glow of the fire in the hearth illuminates Hitler's face, reflecting a man who is ready to set the entire world on fire just to see his enemies burn. This is the beginning of a journey into the heart of a technological nightmare, where the line between genius and insanity completely disappears, and where the ultimate target is not just a city, but the very spirit and survival of the free world itself, as the Nazi war machine begins to pivot its gaze toward the West.
The year is 1942, and the tide of the war is beginning to shift as the United States pours its massive industrial might into the conflict, which leads a furious Hermann Goering to summon the top aeronautical minds of the Third Reich to a high-stakes meeting. In a secluded mountain retreat where the air is thin and the pressure is suffocating, the Reichsmarschall stands before a map of the world with his jewel-encrusted baton pointing toward the North American coastline, while he bellows about the humiliation of the recent Doolittle raid on Tokyo and demands that Germany must strike back at the American heartland with a vengeance that will be remembered for centuries.
He issues an impossible tender to companies like Messerschmitt and Junkers and Heinkel, requiring a bomber capable of carrying a 5,000-kilogram payload over a distance of 6,000 kilometers without any possibility of landing to refuel. the engineers sit in a stunned and terrifying silence because they know that based on the current engine technology, such a request defies the very limits of chemical propulsion and aerodynamics. They look at each other with wide eyes, knowing that to tell Goering his dream is impossible is to risk being labeled a defeatist or a saboteur, which in the eyes of the Gestapo is a death sentence. Yet behind the scenes there is a strange and almost dark humor among the technical staff, who joke that they would need to build a plane made of paper and filled with nothing but high-octane fuel just to get it off the ground.
Goring ignores their practical concerns and promises unlimited funding and a direct line to the Führer's favor for whoever can build this silver bird that will lay waste to the New York docks and the Washington power grid. We see the frantic activity in the design bureaus, where men work 36-hour shifts drinking bitter coffee and smoking endless cigarettes while they try to solve the problem of the weight-to-power ratio using slide rules and hand-drawn charts. It is a scene of desperate intellectual struggle where brilliant minds are forced to serve a chaotic and irrational political will that cares nothing for the safety of the pilots or the reality of the materials available. The Reichsmarshal is obsessed with the prestige of the project, and he treats it like a personal trophy, frequently calling the designers in the middle of the night to ask if the first prototypes are ready to fly over the Atlantic.
What the world did not know was that many of these designs were being built with stolen materials and through the exploitation of slave labor in underground factories, where the human cost was never recorded in the official reports. As the scene develops, we see the first clay models being tested in wind tunnels, where the shapes look more like predatory sharks than traditional aircraft, reflecting the aggressive and predatory nature of the Nazi state. The engineers realized that to achieve the range, they must sacrifice armor and defensive weapons, which would make the America bomber a giant and defenseless target for American fighters if it ever reached its destination. But Goering does not care about defense. He only cares about the propaganda victory of a single bomb falling on the White House or the Brooklyn Bridge.
The atmosphere is one of gilded decadence mixed with impending doom, as the leaders of the Luftwaffe feast on stolen wine and fine food while discussing the destruction of a continent they have never seen. This scene captures the sheer arrogance of the Nazi high command, who believed that their superior will could overcome the basic laws of physics and that they could win a global war through sheer grandiosity and terror.
Meanwhile, in the corners of the room, the younger scientists begin to whisper about even more radical ideas, like refueling in mid-air using giant tankers, or launching the bombers from the decks of modified submarines in the middle of the ocean. These brainstorming sessions represent a descent into a scientific fever dream, where the goal is no longer victory, but a spectacular and fiery end to the world as they know it. As the camera pans across the faces of the weary engineers, we see the dawning realization that they are building a machine that is doomed to fail, but they must continue to play the part of the visionary creators to survive the wrath of their masters.
The camera moves from the smoky boardrooms to the brightly lit hangar of the Messerschmitt factory, where the first physical manifestation of this madness is finally taking shape in the form of the Me-264, an aircraft so massive and sleek that it was nicknamed the America Bomber by the workers who stood in awe of its 4 radial engines and its tricycle landing gear, which was a radical departure from standard German design. We see Willy Messerschmitt himself walking along the fuselage with a look of intense pride mixed with hidden anxiety, because he knows that his reputation and his standing with Hitler depend entirely on this silver giant taking to the skies and reaching the American coast. The plane looks like a predator with its smooth glass nose and its incredibly long and thin wings designed to glide through the thin air of high altitudes where the American interceptors could not reach it. But behind this impressive exterior lies a series of catastrophic engineering compromises that the public was never meant to see. The wings are packed so tightly with fuel tanks that the aircraft is essentially a flying bomb, and the engineers have had to strip away almost all of the defensive machine guns and heavy armor plating just to save enough weight for the takeoff. As the ground crew prepares for the first test flight in late 1942, the tension is thick enough to cut with a knife, because the weight of the fuel alone is so immense that they fear the tires will burst or the landing gear will collapse under the sheer pressure of the massive load. A surprising and little-known detail is that the Me-264 was so heavy during its initial tests that the pilots reported it felt more like steering a mountain than an airplane, and it required a runway so long that they had to specially pave extra kilometers of concrete just to give it a chance to lift off. Manned by a hand-picked crew of brave but skeptical pilots, the engines roar to life with a deafening sound that shakes the windows of the nearby village, and we see the black smoke pouring out as the plane struggles to gain speed down the strip. It finally lifts into the air with a sluggish and agonizing climb that serves as a metaphor for the entire Nazi war effort, which was always fighting against the heavy reality of its own limitations.
while the propaganda films showed the Me-264 as a triumph of German spirit, the reality was that it was a technical nightmare that suffered from constant engine fires and hydraulic failures that nearly killed the test pilots on several occasions.
Even more shocking is the fact that Allied intelligence had already photographed the prototype from high altitude, and instead of being terrified, the British and American analysts laughed at its size, calling it a sitting duck that would be blown out of the sky before it ever saw the Statue of Liberty. The scene captures the tragic irony of brilliant men like Messerschmitt using their genius to build a weapon that was functionally useless in a real war, but served as a perfect tool for Hitler's desperate psychological need to feel powerful. We see the engineers in the hangar late at night, frantically trying to add more engines to the design to solve the power problem, which only leads to more weight and more fuel consumption, in a vicious cycle of failure that mirrors the collapsing state of the German economy. The Me-264 becomes a ghost in the hangar, a beautiful but broken promise that represents the peak of aeronautical design and the depth of strategic incompetence all at once. As the sun sets over the factory, we see the long shadow of the plane stretching across the floor, like a dark finger pointing toward a destination it will never reach, while the sound of distant Allied bombers begins to grow louder in the sky, signaling that the hunters are now becoming the hunted, and that the dream of the America bomber is already beginning to crumble under the weight of its own impossible ambition.
The focus of the documentary now shifts to the massive Junkers factory, where a different kind of monster is being birthed under the watchful and demanding eyes of the SS. This is the U-390, a six-engine colossus that was created by essentially stretching the existing U-290 design into a giant that looked more like a flying fortress than a traditional bomber. The scale of this machine is so immense that the workers look like ants crawling over its wingspan, which stretched over 50 meters. And it is here that we encounter one of the most mysterious and debated legends of the entire war. According to several post-war accounts and secret flight logs, a U-390 took off from a base in France in early 1944 and flew across the cold expanse of the Atlantic to within just 20 kilometers of the New York coastline to take high-altitude reconnaissance photographs of the American skyline. Whether this flight actually happened or was a piece of high-level Nazi propaganda remains a topic of intense debate among historians today.
But the very idea that a German aircraft could have been close enough to see the lights of Manhattan created a wave of panic in the high command of the United States. In this scene, we see the pilots in the cockpit of the Ju-390 shivering in the extreme cold of the unpressurized cabin as they stare at the endless blue of the ocean, knowing that if a single one of their 6 engines failed, they would be swallowed by the waves with no hope of rescue. A surprising and somewhat dark detail of this mission was that the crew had to bring along extra cans of oil and manually pump them into the engines while in flight, a dangerous and exhausting task that shows just how primitive and improvised these miracle weapons actually were. While the Ju-390 was a marvel of size, it was also a logistical disaster because it consumed so much fuel in a single mission that it could have powered an entire fighter wing for a month, which led to heated arguments between Hitler's generals who wanted to protect the oil reserves and his engineers who wanted to prove their genius.
The people of New York were completely unaware that while they were going to the movies and working in their offices, a giant 6-engine shadow might have been lingering just over the horizon, representing the absolute furthest reach of the Nazi claw. We see the Junkers engineers celebrating the successful test flights with schnapps and forced cheers, but the camera captures the fear in their eyes as they look at the empty factory floors, where raw materials are becoming impossible to find due to the constant Allied bombing raids. The Ju-390 was nicknamed the New York Bomber in the German press to boost morale at home. But in reality, only 2 prototypes were ever fully completed, and they spent more time hiding under camouflage nets to avoid being destroyed by British Spitfires than they did in the air.
This scene highlights the shocking gap between the grand illusions of the Nazi leadership and the crumbling reality of their industrial capacity, as they built giant planes that they had no fuel to fly and no pilots to spare. The sight of the U-390 landing in the twilight after a long endurance test serves as a powerful image of a dying regime trying to reach across the world to strike an enemy that was already closing in on its borders from every side, making the entire project a tragic waste of life and intellect in the service of a madman's final and impossible wish.
The story moves into the desperate final years of the war, where the Nazi high command began to lose all touch with reality and turn their attention to the Heinkel HE-277, a plane that was essentially a ghost, born from the ruins of failed designs and the constant lies told to Adolf Hitler. Because the Führer had previously forbidden the development of 4-engine bombers in favor of smaller dive bombers, the engineers at Heinkel had to develop this massive long-range machine in secret under the guise of it being a simple upgrade to the ill-fated HE-177 which was famously known as the Flying Coffin because its engines had a terrifying habit of catching fire in midair. This scene captures the dark and paranoid atmosphere of the Heinkel design offices, where engineers worked behind locked doors and hidden partitions, terrified that the Gestapo would discover they were building a heavy bomber that Hitler had officially canceled.
One of the most surprising and almost comical details of this project was that the designers had to create two sets of blueprints, one that was fake to show the government inspectors, and one that was real to actually build the aircraft, leading to a confusing web of lies that slowed the production down to a crawl. When Hitler finally realized that Germany desperately needed a heavy bomber to reach America, he was furious to find out that the project was years behind schedule. Yet he still expected a miracle to happen overnight in factories that were being turned to rubble by American B-17s. The HE-277 was designed to carry a massive bomb load and featured a pressurized cabin for the crew, which was an incredibly advanced technology for the time. But the materials needed to seal the cockpit were so scarce that the workers often had to use recycled rubber and industrial glue that gave off toxic fumes, making the test pilots dizzy and sick during their flights.
We see the workers in the underground bunkers struggling to assemble the massive wings by candlelight as the power grids failed, and the sound of Allied explosions echoed through the tunnels like a drumbeat of inevitable defeat. There is a chilling moment where we see the prototype being wheeled out of the hangar for a night test, its four engines coughing and spitting blue flames into the darkness, while the engineers pray that it will not explode on the runway like so many of its predecessors did. The tragedy of the He-277 was that it was a technically superior machine compared to the earlier prototypes, but by the time it was ready to be mass-produced, the German Air Force had no more high-octane fuel left, and the pilots who were supposed to fly it were being sent to the front lines as infantry.
This scene emphasizes the chaotic and self-destructive nature of the Nazi bureaucracy, where the left hand did not know what the right hand was doing, resulting in a series of half-finished aircraft that were abandoned in the woods or blown up by their own crews to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. The sight of this silver phantom sitting motionless in a hidden forest clearing as the American tanks began to roll across the German border is a perfect symbol of the America Bomber project as a whole, a grand and lethal ambition that was defeated not just by the enemy, but by the sheer weight of its own internal corruption and the madness of a leadership that believed it could win a war with paper planes and broken promises.
The documentary now moves into a realm where the boundaries between reality and science fiction become blurred as we enter the secretive workshops of the Horten brothers, who were obsessed with the idea of a flying wing that looked more like a modern stealth bomber than anything from the 1940s. This is the Horten Ha-18, a massive and eerie aircraft designed to be the ultimate evolution of the America Bomber, featuring a smooth and triangular shape that lacked a tail or a traditional fuselage in an attempt to minimize drag and evade the primitive radar systems of the time. The scene captures the visionary but terrifying genius of Raymar and Walter Horten as they present their charcoal-covered wooden models to a skeptical and desperate Luftwaffe high command, claiming that their flying wing could carry enough fuel to reach New York and return without ever being detected by the British or American coastal defenses.
A truly shocking and often overlooked detail is that the Horten brothers were planning to mix carbon soot with the glue used to hold the wooden layers of the wings together, which unintentionally created an early form of radar-absorbent material that would have made the plane a ghost on the early radar screens of the Allies. We see the workers in the secluded forest hangars using massive amounts of plywood and specialized glues because high-grade aluminum had become a luxury that the dying Reich could no longer afford, turning this high-tech dream into a wooden giant that was both revolutionary and incredibly fragile. There is a sense of desperate irony as we watch these engineers dreaming of a stealth revolution while their colleagues are being killed in the trenches and their cities are being reduced to ash. Yet they continue to obsess over the perfect curve of the wing, as if the beauty of the design could somehow justify the horror of its intended purpose.
The Horde 18 was designed to be powered by 6 jet engines buried deep within the wing. But since the German jet engines of the time were notoriously unreliable and had a lifespan of only a few dozen hours, the pilots would have been flying a suicide mission over the Atlantic with the constant fear that their engines would melt the very wooden frame they were sitting on. We see the brothers arguing with government officials who wanted to add heavy defensive turrets to the wings, a move that would have ruined the aerodynamics and the stealth profile, showing once again the fatal disconnect between the scientists and the military leaders who could not understand the future of warfare.
This scene highlights the moment when Nazi technology leaped decades into the future out of sheer desperation, creating a blueprint that would later influence the American B-2 stealth bomber. Yet at the time, it was nothing more than a desperate gamble by two brothers trying to please a Führer who was hiding in a bunker. As the camera glides over the sleek and alien-looking wooden skeleton of the Horton wing, we see the flickering light of the hangar reflecting off the smooth surfaces, creating an image of a dark future that was almost realized. A weapon that could have changed the world not through strength, but through invisibility, leaving us to wonder how close the world came to a silent and unseen nuclear strike on the American coast. However, there was a shocking and fatal flaw in Sanger's math that he did not discover until much later, as the heat generated by the re-entry would have been so intense that it likely would have melted the hull of the craft on the very first bounce, turning the pilot into a falling star over the middle of the ocean. Hitler was reportedly fascinated by the idea of a weapon that could strike from space, and he poured millions of marks into the research, even as his armies were retreating on every front and his people were starving in the ruins of their cities. We see the contrast between the clean white lines of Sanger's models and the dirty, smoke-filled reality of the V2 rocket labs, where thousands of prisoners were being worked to death to build the engines that Sanger needed for his dream.
The documentary takes a turn into the most extreme and scientifically advanced chapter of the entire war as we introduce Dr. Eugene Sanger and his brilliant mathematician wife Irene Brett, who together conceptualized the Silbervogel, or the Silver Bird, a project so far ahead of its time that it sounds like a dream from the space age rather than a product of the 1940s. The scene opens in a sterile and quiet research lab where Sanger demonstrates his revolutionary rocket-powered suborbital glider, which was designed to be launched from a 3-kilometer-long monorail track by a massive rocket sled that would accelerate the craft to supersonic speeds before it even left the ground. This was not a traditional airplane, but a space plane that would skip across the top of the Earth's atmosphere like a flat stone being thrown across a quiet pond, a phenomenon known as the skip glide effect, which allowed the craft to cover thousands of miles by bouncing off the dense layers of the air. A fascinating and nearly forgotten detail is that Sanger's calculations were so precise that they eventually formed the basis for the modern space shuttle and the Boeing X-20 Dinosaur. Yet at the time, his fellow German scientists thought he was a dreamer who had spent too much time looking at the stars. We see the CGI reconstruction of the Silverbird glowing red hot as it hits the atmosphere at over 5,000 meters per second, a terrifying vision of a weapon that would have been impossible for any 1944 defense system to intercept or even see until it was too late. The primary goal of this craft was to carry a single 4-ton bomb across the Atlantic and drop it on New York before gliding all the way across the United States to land safely in Japanese-held territory in the Pacific, making it the first true intercontinental spacecraft in human history. This scene highlights the ultimate peak of Nazi scientific arrogance, where they believed they could conquer the vacuum of space before they had even secured the borders of their own country, representing a total detachment from the reality of the war. As the camera zooms out from the small silver model to the vast blackness of the upper atmosphere, we are left with the chilling realization that the America Bomber project was not just about winning a war, but about achieving a terrifying technological godhood that would have allowed the Third Reich to strike any point on the globe with total impunity.
The documentary now enters its most terrifying phase, as the focus shifts to the dark intersection where the America Bomber project meets the secret German nuclear research known as the Uranprojekt. The scene opens in a dimly lit, high-security vault, where we see a small, heavy wooden crate marked with red warning symbols and the insignia of the SS, containing the primitive uranium cubes that Nazi scientists were desperately trying to turn into a functional weapon. We see the notorious physicist Werner Heisenberg and his team working in a hidden laboratory carved into the rock under a castle in Haigerloch, where they are attempting to build a nuclear reactor, while Hitler's messengers demand to know when the ultimate bomb will be ready to be loaded onto the long-range aircraft. A chilling and little-known detail is that the Nazi leadership had already begun calculating the exact amount of radioactive material needed to turn the streets of Manhattan into a poisoned wasteland, not just through a blast, but through the spread of lethal radioactive dust.
In this scene, we see the high-level coordination between the Luftwaffe and the scientists as they discuss the de-urbanization of the United States, a cold and clinical term used to describe the mass murder of millions of civilians with a single strike. The air is thick with a sense of cosmic dread as we see the blueprints for a specially modified Heinkel or Messerschmitt bomber with a reinforced bomb bay designed to carry a device that would change the history of the world forever. There is a shocking moment where a young researcher points out that a single nuclear hit on the Hudson River could create a radioactive tidal wave that would drown the city in toxic water, a plan that Hitler reportedly found particularly satisfying.
we see the workers in the heavy water plants of occupied Norway struggling to produce the necessary components while being hunted by Allied saboteurs, showing that the fate of New York was being decided in the frozen mountains of the north.
The scene highlights the extreme desperation of the German High Command, who believed that if they could just hold on long enough to produce one atomic bomb and one plane capable of delivering it, the United States would be forced to surrender and the Reich would be saved. However, the reality was a mess of internal competition and scientific mistakes, as the different branches of the German government fought over the limited supply of uranium and heavy water, sabotaging their own progress through constant infighting and ego. We see a close-up of a map of New York with a red circle drawn around Times Square, representing the point of impact for a weapon that the Nazis never actually managed to build, but which they dreamed of until their final breath. The scene captures the terrifying what-if of the war, reminding the audience that the America bomber was not just a delivery vehicle for conventional explosives, but a potential herald of a nuclear holocaust that was only stopped by the rapid advance of the Allied armies.
As the camera lingers on the glowing green light of a laboratory beaker, we feel the cold shadow of a future that never was, where the light of 1,000 suns would have extinguished the American dream in a matter of seconds.
The narrative moves away from the secret labs of Germany to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where we discover the strategic chess game involving the Azores Islands, a small Portuguese archipelago that Hitler viewed as the essential stepping stone for a successful airstrike against the American coast. The scene opens with a tense diplomatic meeting in Lisbon, where German spies in sharp suits attempt to bribe and threaten Portuguese officials into allowing the Luftwaffe to build secret refueling bases on the islands, which would have effectively cut the distance to New York in half and made even the smaller German bombers a lethal threat to the United States. A fascinating and often ignored detail is that the German Navy actually had a secret plan called Operation Alaric, which involved a lightning-fast invasion of these islands using paratroopers to seize the airfields before the British or Americans could react, turning a neutral territory into a Nazi aircraft carrier in the center of the ocean.
We see German U-boat commanders scanning the horizon of the Azores through their periscopes, waiting for the signal to launch an amphibious assault that would have changed the entire geography of the air war. The tension is palpable as the scene shifts to Washington, where President Roosevelt and his advisors realize that if the Nazis take the Azores, the city of Washington, D.C. becomes a primary target for a nighttime bombing raid that the American air defenses were not yet prepared to stop. In a surprising twist of history, the British and Americans acted first by putting immense pressure on Portugal to grant them the bases instead, leading to a silent war of shadows between German and Allied agents in the bars and hotels of the islands.
We see the frustration of the German air planners as they realize their bridge to America is being closed by the very diplomatic and naval power they had hoped to bypass with their superweapons. One of the most curious moments in this scene is the German plan to use milk cows, or giant supply submarines, to refuel seaplanes in the middle of the stormy Atlantic, a plan that was nearly impossible due to the choppy waves, but which showed the absolute desperation of the Luftwaffe to find a way across the water. The camera captures the vast and lonely expanse of the ocean, where German pilots would have had to fly for 10 hours in total silence and radio blackout, knowing that a single mechanical failure meant a cold and lonely death in the deep.
This scene highlights how the America Bomber project was not just about building a plane, but about a global struggle for territory and the logistical nightmare of crossing a 5,000-kilometer watery grave. As the sun sets over the volcanic peaks of the Azores, we see the German dream of a mid-Atlantic base sinking into the waves, forcing them back to their drawing boards to find even more radical and dangerous ways to reach their target without ever touching the ground. The scene plunges into the dark and chaotic world of the Mistel project, which was one of the most desperate and bizarre aerial concepts ever devised by the German Luftwaffe, as they realized their giant bombers were too slow and vulnerable to survive a solo trip across the ocean. We see a strange sight in the twilight of an airfield, where a smaller Junkers fighter is bolted directly onto the back of a massive unmanned bomber filled with several tons of high explosives, creating a two-story flying machine that looked like a parasitic insect clinging to its host. This was the German version of a kamikaze weapon, but with a mechanical twist. The plan was for a pilot to fly this clumsy combination across the sea and then release the lower explosive-laden aircraft to glide like a massive guided missile into the skyscrapers of Manhattan or the crowded docks of the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
A surprising and chilling detail that many people do not know is that the Nazis actually considered using volunteer pilots who were willing to fly these machines on one-way missions, essentially creating a European suicide squad to ensure that the bombs hit their targets with mathematical precision.
We see the pilots training in flight simulators made of wood and scrap metal. Their faces pale as they realize that the weight of the explosives makes the aircraft nearly impossible to pull out of a dive. The air is filled with the smell of cheap fuel and the sound of straining metal as these Frankenstein planes struggle to gain altitude, often wobbling dangerously in the wind. There was a specific plan to launch these missile sets from hidden bases in Norway or the Azores, using the cover of a moonless night to slip past the radar of the American coast before the pilot would bail out into the cold ocean to wait for a rescue that would never come.
We see the internal struggle of the engineers who were horrified by the idea of sending their colleagues on suicide missions, yet they were forced to continue by the SS officers who stood over them with clipboards and pistols. This scene captures the absolute moral collapse of the Nazi regime, where human life was treated as just another expendable component in a failing machine of war. The sight of a Mistral composite aircraft hovering over the dark Atlantic like a ghost from a nightmare represents the final evolution of the America bomber, from a sophisticated aircraft into a primitive tool of mass murder and self-destruction. As the camera follows the flight path of these doomed machines, we feel the weight of the desperation that drove men to build such terrifying and suicidal contraptions in a last-ditch effort to bring the fire of the war to the American doorstep. This was the moment when the dream of the super bomber finally lost all its scientific glory and became nothing more than a scream of rage from a dying empire that was determined to take the rest of the world down with it.
The scene shifts from the daring flight plans to the cold and crumbling reality of the German industrial heartland, where the dream of the America bomber is being strangled, not by a lack of imagination, but by a total collapse of the most basic resources. We see the interior of a hidden factory in the Harz Mountains, where the air is thick with the smell of sawdust and low-grade chemical adhesives, because the supply of high-strength aluminum and rubber has been completely severed by the relentless Allied blockade and the constant rain of fire from the Royal Air Force. A shocking and almost absurd detail that illustrates the desperation of this era was the glue crisis, in which the primary factory producing the specialized resin for wooden aircraft like the Horten and the Heinkel was destroyed in a single bombing raid, forcing the engineers to use experimental and untested glues that were literally made from animal remains and industrial waste.
In this scene, we see a massive wing section of an America bomber prototype suddenly and tragically splintering apart during a stress test because the inferior glue simply dissolved in the humidity of the underground tunnel, a moment of crushing silence that reveals the hollow nature of Hitler's final hope. The workers, many of whom are starving prisoners or exhausted elderly men, are seen trying to patch together advanced aeronautical frames with strips of canvas and wire, while the SS officers scream about impossible deadlines and the threat of the firing squad. It is a scene of tragicomedy, where the most advanced blueprints in human history are being built with the materials of the Middle Ages, because the Nazi economy has been reduced to a primitive struggle for survival. We see the chief engineers weeping in their offices as they realize that the engines they have waited months for have been diverted to the collapsing Eastern Front, or have been lost in a train derailment caused by the French resistance. A surprising detail that highlights the logistical madness was the attempt to use Tego film, which was a paper-based adhesive that became so rare that scientists were sent on secret missions to find hidden stockpiles in abandoned warehouses across Europe just to finish a single wing. The camera pans across the factory floor to show rows of unfinished fuselages, sitting like the skeletons of prehistoric giants, gathering dust and rust, while the fuel to even test them becomes a distant memory. This scene captures the total disconnect between the grand maps in Hitler's bunker and the reality of a country where there is no more copper for wiring, no more oil for hydraulics, and no more hope for victory. The America bomber project was being built on a foundation of sand, and every time the sirens wailed above the tunnels, the engineers knew that the clock was ticking toward a final and inevitable zero. As the light flickers and dies in the underground hangar, we see the shadow of a giant aircraft that will never fly. A masterpiece of design that was defeated not by a pilot or a gun, but by the simple fact that a nation that burns its own future cannot build a machine to conquer the world. The scene opens in the cold and clinical environment of a post-war interrogation room, where Albert Speer, the architect of the Third Reich and the Minister of Armaments, sits under the harsh glare of a single electric bulb while being questioned by Allied officers about the sheer waste of the German war machine. Speer, with his characteristic blend of charm and calculated honesty, begins to admit that the America bomber project was perhaps the greatest strategic delusion of the entire war, a black hole that swallowed millions of marks and thousands of hours of elite engineering talent that could have been used to build thousands of defensive fighter jets to protect German cities from annihilation. A surprising and deeply ironic detail that Speer reveals is that Hitler's obsession with a theatrical victory over New York
actually blinded him to the practical reality that Germany was losing the war in its own skies, as every ton of high-grade steel used for a prototype bomber was a ton of steel taken away from the anti-aircraft guns defending Berlin. We see flashbacks to heated meetings in the Reich Chancellery, where Speer tried to explain to a trembling and erratic Hitler that the project was a logistical suicide, but the Fuhrer would simply scream about the cleansing fire that must fall on America, showing a total mental break from the reality of production schedules and resource scarcity. The scene captures the shocking truth that while the German people were being told that a miracle weapon was months away from saving them, the men at the top knew that the America bomber was nothing more than a ghost designed to keep a madman happy in his final days.
We see a montage of brilliant scientists being pulled away from vital defensive work to design complex retractable landing gears for planes that would never have a runway to land on, a chaotic mismanagement that Speer later described as a form of collective insanity within the Nazi leadership. An incredible and little-known fact highlighted here is that the cost of developing just one of the failed America bomber prototypes could have funded the production of over 100 Me-262 jet fighters, which might have actually challenged Allied air superiority and changed the course of the war in Europe. The atmosphere in the scene is one of profound regret and cold realization as Speer looks at the photographs of the ruined German factories and admits that the pursuit of the impossible weapon was the very thing that ensured their total defeat.
The camera lingers on Speer's face as he describes how Hitler would spend hours staring at the globe, spinning it until America was under his thumb, while outside the window, the sound of Russian artillery was already echoing through the streets of Berlin. This scene serves as a powerful critique of how a regime built on ego and spectacle will always prioritize the grand, impossible gesture over the survival of its own people, leaving behind nothing but blueprints for a catastrophe that never came to pass because the system itself had rotted from within long before the first bomb could ever be loaded.
The scene shifts to the secret and high-tension world of the Axis alliance, exploring the mysterious and often overlooked connection between Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan and their mutual desire to bring the war to the American mainland. We see a dimly lit office in Berlin where German officials meet with Japanese naval attachés to discuss the transfer of blueprints and technical data for the long-range bombers, creating a bridge of information that spanned two oceans. A truly surprising and chilling detail of this alliance was the plan for Yanagi missions, where giant German and Japanese submarines would meet in the middle of the Indian Ocean to exchange secret technology, including the plans for the America bomber and even parts for jet engines.
We see the claustrophobic interior of a Japanese I-400 class submarine, the largest in the world, which was essentially an underwater aircraft carrier designed to launch planes against the Panama Canal or the California coast, showing that the dream of a transoceanic strike was not exclusive to Hitler. There is a fascinating and little-known moment where German engineers suggest a joint operation where a Junkers Ju-390 would take off from occupied Europe, fly across the frozen wastes of Siberia, and land in Japanese-occupied Manchuria to refuel, before making a final run over the Pacific to hit the American West Coast. This scene captures the desperate global geometry of the Axis powers as they try to coordinate a pincer movement against the United States using the very limits of aviation technology. We see the Japanese officers politely bowing as they receive the German designs for the Silver Bird, but behind their eyes is the realization that their own industry is also collapsing under the weight of the American blockade, making these grand plans nothing more than a shared fantasy between two dying empires.
The air is filled with the sound of Morse code and the clatter of encryption machines as they try to send coordinates across thousands of miles of enemy-controlled territory, a digital ghost of a plan that was constantly being intercepted by Allied codebreakers. One of the most shocking revelations in this scene is the existence of a plan to use German long-range technology to carry biological weapons, developed by the notorious Unit 731 in Japan, to be dropped on American cities to cause mass plague and chaos. The camera pans across a map of the world where red lines connect Berlin, Tokyo, and New York, representing a web of destruction that was only prevented by the massive distance and the total naval superiority of the Allies. This scene highlights the global scale of the Nazi ambition, showing that the America bomber was not just a European project, but a key piece in a desperate attempt to unite the Axis powers in a final apocalyptic strike against the heart of democracy. As the scene ends, we see a Japanese submarine being depth-charged and sinking into the dark abyss of the Atlantic, carrying the secret blueprints for the super bomber to the bottom of the ocean. A fitting end for a partnership built on mutual destruction and impossible dreams of world conquest.
The documentary reaches its final haunting climax as we witness the last days of the Third Reich, where the America Bomber Project transforms from a military objective into a desperate and ghostly myth hidden in the shadows of the falling regime. The scene opens in the chaotic spring of 1945, with the sounds of Soviet rockets screaming over Berlin and the ground shaking from the weight of Allied tanks, while inside the underground bunkers, the last remaining aeronautical files are being fed into furnaces to prevent them from falling into the hands of the advancing Americans. We see a frantic and surreal image of German engineers at the Junkers and Messerschmitt factories, literally burying the wooden mock-ups and half-finished prototypes of their giant bombers in secret forest pits, or sinking them into the deep, dark lakes of the Bavarian Alps.
A fascinating and largely unknown detail of this final hour is that some of the most advanced blueprints were photographed onto tiny rolls of microfilm and hidden inside the oxygen tanks of U-boats or buried in the walls of remote mountain cabins, as the Nazis hoped that their super technology would be the bargaining chip that could save their lives during the inevitable surrender. In this scene, we see the elite paperclip teams of American intelligence officers racing across the smoking ruins of Germany, hunting for the scientists like Sanger and the Horten brothers before the Soviet Union can capture them. There is a chilling moment where an American officer enters a hidden hangar and finds the skeletal remains of a flying wing, its wooden ribs covered in dust and cobwebs, realizing that the future of the Cold War was sitting right there in a shed. We see the confusion and the moral vacuum of these scientists who, after years of dreaming of the destruction of New York, are suddenly smiling and shaking hands with American colonels, offering their deadly secrets in exchange for a new life in the United States. A surprising fact highlighted here is that many of the original wind tunnel models of the America Bomber were found in a salt mine hundreds of meters underground, perfectly preserved alongside stolen gold and priceless works of art, showing that the Nazi leadership valued these blueprints as much as the wealth of Europe. The atmosphere is one of a funeral for an era of madness, where the grand vision of a global air empire is reduced to piles of burnt paper and shattered glass. We see the final, desperate order signed by a trembling Hitler in the bunker, still asking for the status of the long-range jets even as the walls above him were being pulverized by Russian artillery, illustrating a man who remained a prisoner of his own delusions until the very second he pulled the trigger.
The scene captures the transition from the heat of war to the cold calculation of the coming space race, as the technology designed to incinerate Manhattan is carefully crated and shipped across the ocean to the research labs of New Mexico and Ohio. As the camera pans over the silent, abandoned airfields where the giant bombers were supposed to take off, we see the weeds growing through the cracks in the concrete, a powerful symbol of how nature and time eventually swallow the most arrogant dreams of men. This is the moment when the America Bomber ceases to be a weapon and becomes a ghost of history, a warning of what happens when the absolute peak of human intelligence is harvested by the absolute depth of human evil.
The documentary reaches its final haunting climax as we witness the last days of the Third Reich, where the America Bomber Project transforms from a military objective into a desperate and ghostly myth hidden in the shadows of a falling regime. The scene opens in the chaotic spring of 1945, with the sounds of Soviet rockets screaming over Berlin and the ground shaking from the weight of Allied tanks, while inside underground bunkers, the last remaining aeronautical files are being fed into furnaces to prevent them from falling into the hands of the advancing Americans. We see a frantic and surreal image of German engineers at the Junkers and Messerschmitt factories literally burying the wooden mock-ups and half-finished prototypes of their giant bombers in secret forest pits, or sinking them into the deep, dark lakes of the Bavarian Alps.
A fascinating and largely unknown detail of this final hour is that some of the most advanced blueprints were photographed onto tiny rolls of microfilm and hidden inside the oxygen tanks of U-boats or buried in the walls of remote mountain cabins, as the Nazis hoped that their super technology would be the bargaining chip that could save their lives during the inevitable surrender. In this scene, we see the elite Operation Paperclip teams of American intelligence officers racing across the smoking ruins of Germany, hunting for scientists like Sanger and the Horten brothers before the Soviet Union can capture them. There was a chilling moment where an American officer enters a hidden hangar and finds the skeletal remains of a flying wing, its wooden ribs covered in dust and cobwebs, realizing that the future of the Cold War was sitting right there in a shed. We see the confusion and the moral vacuum of these scientists who, after years of dreaming of the destruction of New York, are suddenly smiling and shaking hands with American colonels, offering their deadly secrets in exchange for a new life in the United States. A surprising fact highlighted here is that many of the original wind tunnel models of the America Bomber were found in a salt mine hundreds of meters underground,
perfectly preserved alongside stolen gold and priceless works of art, showing that the Nazi leadership valued these blueprints as much as the wealth of Europe. The atmosphere is one of a funeral for an era of madness, where the grand vision of a global air empire is reduced to piles of burnt paper and shattered glass. We see the final desperate orders signed by a trembling Hitler in the bunker, still asking for the status of the long-range jets, even if the walls above him were being pulverized by Russian artillery, illustrating a man who remained a prisoner of his own delusions until the very second he pulled the trigger.
The scene captures the transition from the heat of war to the cold calculation of the coming space race, as the technology designed to incinerate Manhattan is carefully crated and shipped across the ocean to the research labs of New Mexico and Ohio. As the camera pans over the silent, abandoned airfields where the giant bombers were supposed to take off, we see the weeds growing through the cracks in the concrete, a powerful symbol of how nature and time eventually swallow the most arrogant dreams of men. This is the moment when the America bomber ceases to be a weapon and becomes a ghost of history, a warning of what happens when the absolute peak of human intelligence is harvested by the absolute depth of human evil.